Hi and welcome to Different Leaf, a show for new and experienced cannabis consumers. I'm Brit Smith. This episode, we're going to explore how the world's newfound love of cannabis-infused foods is helping to revive some of our most beloved eateries after COVID. For many local restaurants, diners, and cafes, the pandemic was extremely hard to come back from. Despite the initial rebound of customers when COVID restrictions first relaxed, many food service places never really got to reopen their doors, and some of those who didn't make it very long. They were struggling to get people in the door since 2020 because now much of the way that we eat out is through delivery. According to the restaurant research firm Technomic, restaurant numbers in the US have dropped from about 700,000 pre-COVID to about 630,000 today. And they don't predict that number will return to pre-COVID levels anytime soon. Thankfully, it seems like the cannabis plant has been giving a new lease on life to lots of formerly shuttered eateries. A wave of chefs have been catching on to the relatively new trend of infusing food with CBD and THC. And now they're rethinking their missions, pivoting their menus, and reopening with cannabis-forward dishes. They're finding that their weed-infused offerings are an essential tool which has helped them to adapt and stay in the game, because COVID-weary customers have been ordering more relaxing CBD product treats online, and they've started returning to enjoy the new social experience of eating infused food together. Today we're going to talk to Chef Andrew LeSturgeon and his right-hand man Will Fleming from Milkweed Cannabis Confections in Burlington, Vermont. Way before COVID, Chef Andrew opened one of the most exciting fine diners/cocktail bars in Vermont, Monarch and the Milkweed. They used to serve things like upscale breakfast sandwiches and high-end pastries made with award-winning cheeses from local Vermont farms. He had incredible house-made ice cream, froyo and sorbet, delectable CBD chocolates, and a carefully considered cocktail menu. After the pandemic closure, Chef Andrew reopened Monarch and the Milkweed in September of 2021 just as a cocktail bar. Sadly, they never revived their original menu, but they did return to serve pizza and salad in partnership with their next-door neighbors. They adjusted and they did their thing for about a year, but by the end of 2022, Monarch and the Milkweed had officially joined the throngs of US restaurants that had closed their doors for good due to COVID-19. However, thanks to cannabis, their story is not over yet, not by a long shot. Because they already had the Milkweed Cannabis Confection brand launched and on the go, that became their new guiding star. Like many other passionate and scrappy restaurateurs, Andrew and Will are now reviving the brand and making their post-pandemic comeback by focusing solely on CBD and THC treats. Their plan is to stay true to their roots by continuing to use the high-end local ingredients, but they'll be infusing it all with organic, full-spectrum cannabis under the name Milkweed Cannabis Confections for Vermont and Massachusetts customers. We'll be right back to chat with Chef Andrew LeSturgeon and Will Fleming about how cannabis is reviving their culinary dream with Milkweed Cannabis Confections. Before I'm going to talk about what you're doing now, let's talk about your backstory. Andrew, how did you end up in Burlington, Vermont?
I was born and raised in Indianapolis, Indiana, and moved to New York City and was there for a little over 11 years and worked for some of the best chefs on the planet, sort of accidentally, and generated a resume and some skill sets that were pretty hard to come by that I'm pretty proud of. And Hurricane Sandy hit New York City, and I was up at a little cabin I was renting for maybe a couple 3-day weekends a month in Lincoln, Vermont. And my current employer said, just stay up there for a while. We can't use you here. If you do come back, we don't need your help. We'll give you a 5-day heads up when we need you back in the city. And I ended up staying up here for about 2.5, 3 weeks. And after about 7 or 8, 9 days, I saw this ad on Craigslist that this place called Hen of the Wood in Waterbury was looking for a pastry chef, and I'd never heard of it. And I drove up there, and I got the job, and I took a 95% pay cut and moved from the West Village of Manhattan into an off-grid cabin in the mountains of Vermont. and started working for what I would consider one of the best chefs and business owners in my new home state of Vermont, where I've been for, ironically, a little bit over 11 years now.
Wow.
I was Eric Warnsted's pastry chef for Hen of the Wood Waterbury while we worked on and designed and built Hen of the Wood Burlington inside of Hotel Vermont. Opened that restaurant with him with a team of about 5 pastry cooks and was his pastry chef for 4 or 5 years. And then I met my business partner, Rob Downey, and we opened Monarch and the Milkweed on St. Paul Street on City Hall Park in downtown Burlington. We sort of nicknamed it as a fine diner. It's a pastry shop, ice cream shop, breakfast, lunch, dinner, cocktails, wine and beer, and, of course, Milkweed. My first introduction to cannabis professionally was at the first medical dispensary in the state of Vermont in Montpelier. And I was introduced to the founders of that dispensary during the first few months of living and working here. And I ended up making a small series of edibles for that medical dispensary. I guess that was around 2012, 13, 14, 15, under the name Little Sweets by Hen of the Wood, which was my nickname the first day I started working for Hen and Waterbury. Some of the cooks there named me Little Sweets. You can't tell by this audio, but I'm a 6'5" pastry chef. So that stuck. And the pastry brand that I sort of developed under Hen that I represented at the dispensary in Montpelier, Vermont Patients Alliance, was Little Sweets by Hen of the Wood. And I continued doing that until we opened Monarch and the Milkweed. Milkweed was born about 8 or 9 months after we opened Monarch and the Milkweed downtown as a CBD, full-spectrum CBD line of whimsical confections that include a series of gumdrops and truffles and little chocolate bars and some fudge items and a few more things. And for several years, we were able to sell that through a network of wholesale accounts, including the Lincoln General Store, some cannabis-focused stores, some out-of-state stores, but nothing really licensed cannabis legal because it was 2014 Farm Bill hemp defined as a product with 0.3% THC or less. That law changed in our state, at least, about 6 months ago. And the CCB took over the hemp program in the state of Vermont and sort of redefined the legal definition of hemp. So we discontinued that line after about 6 years, and we're reintroducing milkweed into the adult rec market in Vermont this year.
Well, that's the whole interview. Oh my gosh! Wow.
Great. It was so nice.
Thanks for
to meet
telling us how you
What?
got to Burlington,
Great.
Andrew.
Sorry.
No.
Edit it out.
Get rid of all of it.
I'll edit myself in. Thank you so much for the backstory. So really, as your presence in Vermont goes, Monarch and the Milkweed was, as you called it, the fine diner.
Yeah.
Was the first foray into the area, and then Milkweed Cannabis Confections was something that you did just a few months later. Who opens a whole fine dining restaurant and then opens like a cannabis confectionary within 6 months?
Yeah.
What is your connection to cannabis and why are you so crazy?
Oh, you need to ask my shrink that question. I've always, not always, but as an adult, been a somewhat, I wouldn't say frequent user for my whole adult life, but I've always been in touch with cannabis and the benefits of that, mainly at nighttime, part of my sort of relaxing routine and sort of sleep hygiene sort of chapter at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. And I had very little experience sort of infusing butters at my own apartment in the West Village occasionally and some other stuff, but never really thought of it as like a professional avenue or even as a business or a brand until I started working at the dispensary in Montpelier, Vermont. It sort of occurred to me like, wow, I could sort of leverage the skill sets, techniques, glamour, and know-how that I sort of learned over a decade in New York City and merge that with the state of Vermont sort of gravitates towards like very high integrity ingredients and farms and makers and very true, genuine ingredients. Mm-hmm. And I did so in a cannabis confection brand called Milkweed.
Was it like local hemp? Because all of your ingredients for all of your dishes seem to be, really based in what's locally around you, the blueberries and the milk. Did you do the same for the cannabis, for the CBD? Is it locally sourced?
Yes, all of our cannabis inputs, both for the CBD line that we distributed and manufactured, we designed and made for 5 or 6 years, and also going forward, of course, for the THC-focused adult rec line, have generally all come from the Northeast Kingdom in Vermont, from ironically, the same cultivator who used to be at Vermont Patients Alliance, and now he and his lovely wife have their own farm in the Northeast Kingdom near Hardwick, Greensboro, and they are providing us with some of the best cannabis inputs in the state.
That's awesome. So, you're still sticking with that local vibe. Obviously, this was before COVID. Once you were hit by COVID, everything had to change for you guys. And that's the point at which, a lot of folks in the service industry had to adapt and just sort of roll with the punches and go home. And like you were up in Vermont, for that storm. And like sometimes these massive natural disasters just sort of realign us and change us. And that's what happened with Monarch and the Milkweed. So tell me about that transition that you had to make, closing down this beloved staple store that you'd built and designed, and then, really focusing in on the cannabis confectionary.
Very, very well said. COVID hit this planet in a pretty traumatic, very real way that we experienced on a 24-hour basis, constantly editing and realizing how severe it was. I recently read the email I sent the staff on March 17th of 2020 that announced that we were not opening the following day. And as I sent it, I remember with tears in my eyes and on the office above the restaurant saying out loud, "This might be 2 weeks." And of course, it was a lot longer than 2 weeks. I think, Will, you remember that.
Yeah, I remember you were literally in tears. And you said, this might be 2 weeks. And then, there we were 18 months later, still kind of picking up the wreckage.
Oh,
right.
Gosh.
But silver linings exist in every experience that we have. And one of the biggest silver linings of this was that I was able to sort of back away from the business of Monarch and the Milkweed, which was a full power downtown restaurant with wholesale dessert programs, CBD confections, over 35 employees, opening at 7:30 in the morning and closing at 2 in the morning, 363 days a year.
Wow.
And it gave me the opportunity to back away from that and then focus on how we wanted to put that back together in a more efficient way that serviced our world that is a new world after COVID hit, including and especially the restaurant industry and the support staff and my colleagues that service that industry. It really changed quite a bit. So we were able to pause and then slowly decide, after analyzing all the pieces of Monarch and the Milkweed, what are we going to do? When are we going to do it? And we ended up reopening Monarch and the Milkweed as a cocktail bar, which we were really, really strong in. And I fell in love with, actually, within a week or two of opening in 2016. It was very clear that this was going to be a very cocktail-focused place. Mm. And as a pastry chef, it is typical for the pastry department of a restaurant to sort of back up the bar in terms of syrups and infusions and herbal tinctures and whatnot. So I had quite a bit of experience doing that and understanding the ingredients of cocktails and wine and beer for my entire career. And Monarch and the Milkweed ended up in 2016, started as a cocktail-heavy, strong, high-integrity cocktail bar, which sort of wasn't to be expected a couple months prior to opening. Sure. And it also happened to be part of the business that was working financially better than other parts. So we decided to reopen Monarch and the Milkweed September of 2021, I think, right, Will? Yep. As a cocktail bar only. Mm-hmm. During COVID, we continued designing and producing Milkweed confections and distributing to our wholesale partners that were still open. COVID also gave us 18 months to review that and focus on marketing, and Will became a bigger presence in Milkweed. And
I suppose we should probably bring Will into this at some point.
Yeah, Will, I'm stumbling right now.
Will, tell us what your role is with Milkweed and how you saw that change happening over COVID.
Yeah, sure. So I joined the Monarch and the Milkweed team right as Andrew was getting ready to expand the Milkweed brand specifically. And I actually, ironically, knew Andrew from selling him Vermont-based craft gin and whiskey that I was working for, running the Vermont sales for them. We got a relationship just from kind of me spending a lot of time at Monarch and the Milkweed as a favorite haunt of my own and also a buyer of mine. And Andrew approached me one day and said, "Hey, I'm trying to